Hello, everyone, and welcome to the ASCM's The Chain Podcast. We're kicking off 2025 with a hot topic that's been all over the news feeds, and that's tariffs. I'm excited to be joined by Alastair Charatan, an independent supply chain expert, a lecturer, as well as the host of the podcast Supply Chain Talk. Alastair and I are going to discuss some of the impact of the proposed tariffs, make some of the predictions of our own, and then we're going to return a few months from now to see how accurate we were on our predictions. Alastair, thanks for joining me today.
It's great to join you, Abe.
This has been all over the news ever since the election, before it even decided, was the talk of tariffs from the previous administration to the current administration to the new administration. What's your take? What do people think they are, and what are they actually?
Well, I guess the first thing to say is no one knows, and love him or not, Donald Trump does have a lot of opinions and a lot of things to say, and he does sometimes change his mind. I think it's fair to say. So at the moment, what he said is he's going to charge an extra 10%, sorry, a 25% tariff on anything imported from Mexico or Canada, and 10% in addition as an extra tariff on anything imported from China. So I think it's surprised a lot of people because Mexico and Canada, after all, are part of the US, Mexico, and Canada Free Trade Agreement. And it was only during President Trump's first administration that that agreement replaced the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, which had been running for many, many years. So it's kind of strange to immediately be almost demolishing what he himself put in place just a few years ago. And I think at the same time, people were slightly surprised that with all the rhetoric that he'd been sort of building up about China, actually it's a relatively modest extra 10% on them. Not to say that's not, still a lot of money on a big import balance there, but nonetheless, it's perhaps not as much as people might have expected. So that's kind of what's been announced, and I guess the question is, will that actually happen come January, or will things change? Will other countries be subject to tariffs? So that's what we need to see.
Tariffs aren't new. The first administration, we saw some of the impact of tariffs on China on specific products. Is this different than before? Why is this different than before?
I think the big difference to me is the fact that it's affecting those countries, Mexico and Canada, those important neighbors. These are big trading partners. They used to be part of a trade agreement, or they are still part of a trade agreement. And for that reason, a lot of companies, I think, understandably took strategic decisions to say, well, it's not right for us to be manufacturing in China and the Far East. We will bring manufacturing closer to home, both shorten our supply chains and the benefits of that, but also to, just to not to be exploiting low-cost labor in the Far East quite so much. We're getting that balance more of perhaps having higher labor costs, but lower transport costs and shipping costs. So I think the fact that people have made pretty major strategic decisions on that basis, almost thinking they're doing the right thing, and yet now almost being told, no, that's not on. It's 25% tariffs on those countries. So I think that's what's different here.
Interesting. Are there options? Are there ways to avoid or to mitigate the tariffs?
Yeah, well, in terms of mitigating tariffs, and there's plenty of kind of evidence of what's happened in the past. I think the options are, I guess, the sort of the short term, very limited short term option is you can build up your inventories. So, and companies have already been doing that during November and indeed during December. Bringing in components and raw materials where they can, bringing in finished goods when they can. Thinking, well, kind of, I'd rather incur the extra warehousing and cash flow impact of that, kind of suffer that for a few months, rather than take a risk of being hit by a 25% tariff. But clearly, there's only so much you can do there. You're tying up money. You need warehouse space. You've got a risk of stockpiling the wrong products, and you may then be landed with them and have to discount them. So it's a kind of rather limited option, that, but a wise one to do if you can. The second option is to put up prices, and that is what has happened in the past. And this is where it's going to be very difficult to predict what will happen, because I think President Trump will not want to become unpopular. He will not want to put up the cost of living, having campaigned quite considerably during the election campaign on the cost of living. So if suddenly, within months of him taking office and putting in tariffs, prices are going up for this good and that good and so on, I don't think it's going to be a great story for him. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens there. But companies certainly may have no choice but to say, well, look, we just haven't got a 25% profit margin on this product. So what can we do? We've got to put the price up. I mean, and to say to the supplier, well, you take the 25% hit. Well, there's not many suppliers in this world who have got a 25% profit margin where they can take the hit. So ultimately that hit's going to be passed on to the consumer. And then the sort of third option is really about the sourcing strategies, which I guess is what this is all around. And ultimately, I think it's the aim of what we're doing here, because, it's saying, well, let's have more jobs in the US. Let's not kind of export jobs in a way to low cost countries. And therefore, can we, move manufacturing, instead of being, in Canada and Mexico, let's bring it into the US, or instead of being in China, maybe it goes to other Far East countries. So I guess that's ultimately the sort of perhaps the big strategic choice that companies are facing here.
It's interesting. The first two you've identified in terms of the inventories or passing it along, those are short-term responses to the proposed tariffs. The third is a little bit more long-term, as you indicated, in terms of supplier selection. We hope it's a little bit longer term, that you keep your suppliers connected. Give me a sense of the planning horizon right now for supply chain professionals. As you indicated here, the proposed tariffs on Canada, Mexico are a significant shift away from the rhetoric that we had in the USMCA in terms of nearshoring and reshoring. And so a lot of decisions were made in terms of mitigating that initial wave of tariffs. Now we have a shift in the proposed tariffs on our neighbors. So the short-term strategies are running headlong into your long-term strategy of nearshoring and reshoring. Give me a sense of, what's the effect that it's going to have on supply chains, specifically on Canada and Mexico. We know the impact that it's already had on China.
In past tariff rounds, some US companies have been able to increase their production and increase their capacity in their US factories, because they already had US factories. So whether that was running more shifts, increasing the number of days per week, or whatever it might be, if you've got your factory, you can relatively quickly gear up your production. Even then, you're talking about many months. You can't just recruit and train a workforce at the click of a finger. It takes time. Companies lucky enough to be in that situation can make their analysis and may decide that's what they want to do, and they'll be able to do it. If, on the other hand, at the moment you just do not have any manufacturing in the US, or you've got very limited footprint of manufacturing, and you just cannot expand that, well, to build a new factory, to find the land, or to add a production line to an existing factory, I mean, this is all, we're talking about a year or two, I would say, at least. Even if it's a case of you got the building, but you need to kind of buy in your specialist equipment and get a production line, bedded down and started up. So all of this is not short term, which is why the whole rhetoric is very kind of alarming, where people have made decisions, and yet you're being told, well, tough, if you can't do anything by January, the tariffs are starting then. I mean, it's kind of, even if you can find suppliers and so on in the US, it's unlikely they can gear up significant production in a matter of months. So that's why people are going to suffer. And as we said, if you can't actually set up manufacturing to avoid the tariffs in less than many months or even years, well, you can only stockpile for a few months. So actually, in a way, the only strategy is take the hit in terms of your profit, which isn't great for kind of growth and for reinvestment, or pass the hit on to the consumer. So there are not many happy eventualities that I can see in this.
Interesting, because not every industry is going to be hit similarly. Obviously, there are specific industries that can shift suppliers or the location of manufacturing, where in other industries, for example, our steel industries, you're not going to put up a foundry in quarters here. Are there specific industries that are going to be hit a little bit harder than others?
Yeah, well, I think anything that uses steel as a raw material or as a component in products is going to be hit. I was reading just recently, Citigroup reckoned that the tariffs that had been announced would add 15 to 20% to the cost of steel for US manufacturers. Now, depends how much steel is in a product. If it's just a casing of a complex product, then the steel content may be only a few percent of the product cost, and therefore even a 15 or 20% increase is not going to add much to the overall product cost. But if it's something with a high steel content, clearly that's has a huge impact, and in industries like construction and so on, that's going to really have a market impact. So that's kind of one example of an industry that would be certainly hit hard. I mean, in terms of others, I think we touched earlier on fresh produce. Now, of imported fruit and vegetable, more than 50% of all the fruit and vegetables that the US imports come from Mexico. Now, what are you going to do? You can't suddenly grow those crops in a matter of months. I mean, even if farmers decided to switch and sort of repurpose some of their agricultural land to alternative crops, which would otherwise be hit by tariffs. I mean, that's again, you're talking about at least probably a year before this year's crops they're not going to suddenly plant them in the spring and switch to a totally different crop. So even then, you're probably talking more than a year away before they could avoid some of these tariffs on fresh fruit and vegetables. So yeah, I mean there's a lot of industries that are going to be hit hard by it.
It's interesting, Alistair, because let's go back to your options in terms of what organizations can do. You can't stockpile fruit. That's a very different type of inventory. So the impact to the consumer in particular industries, for example, as you indicated, perishable foods, obviously, garments, or our clothing. It's the labor arbitrage. It's extremely difficult. So sector by sector, there are unique challenges that almost impact each of the supply chains. How much of it is going to be passed on to the consumer?
Taking fruit and vegetable, I mean, it's hard to see. I mean, to be fair, I don't know the margins in US
Yeah.
fruit and veg produce. From the farmers, suppliers, kind of producers and so on, and the retailers. But typically, there are not high margins in farming and agriculture, and they are not high margins in supermarket grocery retail. So it's hard to see how that cost wouldn't be passed on to the consumer, because I just don't think anyone else can take the cost. I mean, it might encourage kind of sharper kind of working practices to try and avoid wastage and losses and so on, possibly. But it's hard to see really how that cost won't get passed on to the consumer. Or, worse still is if actually that means then consumers just don't buy so much fresh fruit and vegetables and buy highly processed foods, which is the new health secretary I know has got some opinions on that. But I mean, it's sad to say in our modern world, I mean, ultra processed foods tend to be cheap and appealing to the lower income consumer, and it will be very sad if health wise it switches people away from fresh fruit and vegetables to buying what they see as cheaper, more affordable products. In terms of garments, I think again, you rightly say, I mean, there's a high labor content in garments. So, when they're being currently manufactured in
Yeah.
low labor cost countries, it's hard to imagine that type of product, that type of industry moving wholesale back to US manufacture. And therefore, I think those will be subject to the tariffs. And again, by definition, they're already fast, throwaway fashion. It's low cost. It's appealing to the low income consumer, though across the board as well. So again, I think it's hard to see how some of that cost won't get passed on. I mean, it may be that some of the retailers will absorb that to stay competitive, but I would predict that some of those garment prices would be creeping up.
Interesting, the dilemma for our supply chain professionals, developing long-term solutions to short-term problems that are facing them today. Unpredictably, this is very, dynamic in terms of what the impact is going to be. How do you think supply chain professionals can balance that long-term planning with the uncertainty that you've identified in the short term?
The first thing I'd say is that they've got to understand the options and understand the pros and cons. And I think looking on the positive side, I think it will certainly prompt a lot of organizations to look again at reshoring and possibly at nearshoring if they take a view and think surely President Trump will not go through with 25% on Mexico and Canada.
Mhm.
It just doesn't seem the right balance. I would say, I'd more expect 10% on Mexico and Canada and 20% on China, but I mean that's the alternative opinion. But I think it will certainly prompt people to look again at that reshoring or nearshoring decision. And I think some organizations may be genuinely surprised because I think this is where kind of all of us as supply chain professionals kind of know the principles of supply chain, which isn't not just cost, which is in a way what we've been focusing on. It's all around the whole supply chain cost, and that means lead time, responsiveness, the cost of inventory, the cost of how to reduce inventory because it's becoming obsolete. Reshoring in particular, you're hugely cutting your lead time, you're cutting away on the uncertainty, the risks of delays at sea or whatever it might be. You're increasing your responsiveness hugely, and it might be that companies are surprised when they look at that and realize that the extra labor cost they'll be paying compared to all those other benefits gives a very different opinion. And I think the other point is that, of course, in the recent years, automation has advanced
Yeah.
enormously in all parts of the supply chain, both in manufacturing and indeed in sort of warehousing and distribution. So again, when people look at that balance now, I think there's an option to reduce the labor content by investing in automation. And I think it'll be very interesting. I think some organizations might be surprised to find that they can make that reshoring move a lot more cost effectively than they might have thought even a few years ago.
It's interesting because the buildup of any sector or center of excellence in terms of efficiencies and effectiveness requires that ecosystem, not just the labor or the facility itself. What surrounds that organization, their suppliers. Does this give an opportunity to reevaluate their entire manufacturing process as opposed to just a specific response to the tariffs?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I think yes, some of the options as well, of course, are the extent to there's not many products which are kind of like which are apart from say fruit and vegetables, which
Right.
literally from start to finish are made in one country. I mean,
Right.
as we all know from supply chains and from the fantastic TV series The Chain, which I know is coming out shortly. The world is so interconnected in terms of trade, and therefore it's even if you're making a product in the US, kind of a small control chip may well be coming in from the Far East.
Yeah.
If you've got a battery component to it, that also may be manufactured, elsewhere. So I think what it does allow companies to do, and again, looking on the bright side of tariffs, it will certainly prompt people to really examine these options. It may allow them to sort of weigh up what components may be made effectively
Mhm.
overseas and imported, even if we pay a tariff on that component, and what do we do as the value add manufacturing in the US? And so there's a lot of options there, and that can include, of course, late customization, late
Mhm.
personalization of products. You may have a sort of common base product, and then that can be turned into all sorts of different varieties later in the day. So there's quite a lot of options around that, which means that you can reduce the impact of the tariff by even if you're not making the entire product in the US, you're doing the final assembly and final manufacturing in the US.
Alistair, you talked a little bit before about sort of the global nature of supply chains. Quite a bit has been discussed about regionalization of supply chains to either reduce the risk of disruptions that we've seen. Obviously, a significant focus on resiliency today because we don't know what the next disruption is going to look like today. Are we moving closer to regionalization and local supply chains? Or are we still looking at a dependency on global supply chains for the majority of our products and services and the benefits that it's provided over the past 20 to 30 years?
Yeah, I think there is, yeah, I think there's certainly some trend to regionalization, but I think it is fair to say that it is a global world that we're in, and just there's some industries, some manufacturing is so specialized that centers of excellence develop, and the most surprising ones I know in the chain, the episode on the medical, the health supply chain, that Silcot in Pakistan, was in India, a city which is really specialized in making surgical instruments. Now,
Right.
it's extraordinary that that sort of grew up there. They can obviously source the right quality of steel. They've got the skilled, workforces who, and a lot of this is still hand, finished and so on. And so a kind of an example like that, it's why would you have a sort of, I don't know, a European manufacturer of surgical instruments if you can get them very effectively from India instead, and air freight them, at sort of fairly modest cost, because of course they're small and high value. So I think, while there will be some regional, direction, I still think we're talking about global. The other factor to bear in mind, of course, is also the environmental impact of supply chains, and
Yeah.
I think consumers particularly are increasingly, you know, happier if they can see a product is made locally and sourced locally. And making products on the other side of the world and loading them onto diesel-powered, kind of, oil-powered vessels to take them across the oceans. I think people realize that may be not a great way of having the minimum carbon footprint. So that's another factor, which is why, again, when one looks at that reshoring, nearshoring analysis, that modeling, I think again one can think about, would there be a slight increase in sales, even if you can say, yeah, this is a US manufactured product, low
Right.
carbon footprint and so on. It's certainly a selling point to many consumers nowadays.
Yep. The global nature of supply chains indicates that we can find almost suppliers anywhere in the world and get it cheaply or inexpensively delivered to us. Supplier relationships have taken on a significant focus since the pandemic, specifically because of the lack of visibility that we had into our extended supply chains. How do we balance that need to maintain strong supplier relationships
Mm.
with I need to shift my manufacturing because of the tariffs?
Yeah, well, I think it's a really good question, because you're absolutely right. I think, again, in terms of supply chain management, good practice is developing, close, long-term relationships with suppliers, not shifting around and finding the lowest cost supplier the whole time. And, the risk of the tariffs is that it could make people switch from one country to another. And I guess, what we're already seeing, with the Mexico-Canada example, is that you could make a shift like that and then, suddenly find, a year later, oh, now there's tariffs on that new supplier, and then you think, oh, well, I might as well go back to my old one, but by then you've
Either
lost
one.
your relationship and
Yeah.
that supplier is now full up or whatever. So I think, so I think tariffs definitely, anything that disrupts supply chains is not good news, when, the whole principle of supply chain is to try and build up good, reliable, steady supply chains with close relationships. On the one hand, organizations need to really analyze carefully, what are some of their options, and as we recognize, short-term inventory is only a matter of, weeks or months,
Right.
solution. Passing on prices to consumers, well, I guess that could be a longer term option, but it's
Yeah.
not, probably not a desirable one if your competitors are a better place. So understanding your options for sourcing are really important. I guess you need to really model a lot of different scenarios and outcomes to say, well, if we made this move, what would happen if, suddenly other tariffs came in, or the tariffs we're planning to avoid actually were then reduced, or removed? What would happen then? So I think it is really important to look at a lot of different possibilities before making major strategic sourcing decisions.
There's a lot of noise in the background right now. What should a consumer pay attention to? We've inundated them with information about our supply chains, and people are aware of their supply chains today. Do tariffs matter to the consumer today?
I mean, it's an interesting one. I mean, I guess if you're thinking about buying a car,
Yeah.
and you've researched the model you're interested in, and you think, oh, that car's made in a factory in Mexico. It might make you think
Yeah.
I might get one from the dealer while he's got one in stock, rather than leave it 6 months and find it's gone up 10% in price. I mean, genuinely, if I was in that situation, I might be thinking about it. There's been recent publicity about I think the price of cocoa
Yeah.
increasing, and therefore chocolate prices and coffee prices might be going up as well in the next 6 months. So I guess, on a short-term basis, some people might say, "Oh, I'm going to fill my store cupboard with my favorite coffee beans."
So they're stockpiling their inventories right now.
Exactly. But let's face it, that's going to save you what, a few tens of dollars at best, rather than potentially a few $1,000s if you're buying a car. So I think anyone making a major purchase, whether it
Yeah.
might be white goods or an automobile or whatever, I think it's probably worth them having a think about what they're choosing and who's supplying it, and not delaying it too much, which, funnily enough, could be a little short-term boost to the economy if it
Yeah.
if it makes so many consumers move their purchases forward by a few
Yeah.
months. Again, I think it will be a short-term effect.
All right, time for predictions, Alistair. 6 months from now, what are we talking about in terms of tariffs? Are we talking about a negative impact? Are we talking about a positive impact? What are we talking about 6 months from now?
I think if we have tariffs, they will have a negative impact. No question. Tariffs always have a negative impact, sadly. Yeah, so overall, it have a negative impact. However, if there are tariffs, it might have a slight boost to some manufacturing sectors in the US. There may be, as I talked about, kind of some factories expanding their capacity and so on. But I think overall, it would not be good for the economy. I think the other question is, will the tariffs that have been announced rather
Yeah.
unofficially actually come to pass? I would be really surprised if those 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada,
Mhm.
are imposed and are retained. I have to say, I'd be really surprised. I think, 10% tariffs, for those countries and for China, more likely, but I'd be surprised if higher tariffs are imposed. And I think the final thing we haven't talked about is kind of, this isn't just a Donald Trump game. I mean, this is
Yeah.
where the global economy and other countries are not powerless. And as we saw,
Yeah.
I think with the last round of tariffs, US imposes tariffs on some items. Well, Europe and other countries impose tariffs on Harley Davidson bikes and so on. And I think actually that led to Harley Davidson moving some of their production from the US
Right.
overseas. So, kind of it's a two-way game. And so I think if tariffs were imposed, there would be some retaliatory tariffs also imposed, which would kind of, and hopefully it doesn't escalate, and people kind of realize, all right, 10% is probably enough, and let's leave it at that for a while and see what happens then.
It's interesting because we used to think of long-term planning and that you can rely on certain rules of the game. And it seems like the rules of the game are changing on us as we speak today. And
Mm.
yet we're anticipated to predict what your demand is and how to supply that today. Is our job for the supply chain professionals getting any easier, or is it getting more difficult today?
Well, certainly tariffs don't make life easier for sure. But I think, to be fair, I mean, as supply chain professionals, we're always planning for changes, aren't
Yeah.
we? I mean, you're going to be looking at your key commodities, your key components, and what are the likely movements of price and so on. And indeed, you'll be looking to potentially make some stock investments there. I can remember when
Yeah.
I was in some companies I worked in. And certainly when suppliers announced price rises coming up in January, we literally had to hang a little internal program called Fill Your Boots, which was kind of work out how much stock we should sensibly invest in to tide us over for a few months. And when the price rise came in, indeed, we could pass on that price rise to customers, and we would have benefited by buying at the old price. So yeah, I think we're all used to looking at changing prices, changing costs, and working out how best to use them. And what I would say is that I think nowadays there are some great software tools to help us do
Yeah.
that modeling and model those different scenarios and work out what to do, which does help us make those decisions more effectively and quickly.
Alastair, thank you so much. It's clear that we have more to talk about, and we're going to come back to this in about 6 months to see how accurate our predictions are. I'm excited not only for the changes that are imposed upon us, but we are innovators. Supply chain professionals are inherent problem solvers. And so it's going to be interesting to see the solutions that come out of the dynamic environment that we're facing today.
It certainly will be. And my only worry is that our predictions may be totally wrong, but it'll be an interesting discussion in a few months' time for sure.
Wonderful, Alastair. Thanks again.
My pleasure.